The HOA president thought he could bully a kid on his own street until the boy's dad walked out with a badge that changed everything. If you love shocking HOA stories like this, hit subscribe, you won't want to miss the next one. It started as an ordinary Saturday in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Families were out mowing their lawns, kids were riding bikes, and the smell of barbecue smoke curled up into the blue summer sky. The streets looked picture perfect, the kind of place that could be featured on a postcard, but in neighborhoods like this, perfection doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes, beneath the neatly trimmed hedges and freshly painted fences, tension lingers, especially when power-hungry HOA presidents are involved. The man who ran this neighborhood's homeowners association had a reputation that stretched far beyond the cul-de-sac. He wasn't just strict, he was feared. Some whispered that he treated the neighborhood less like a community and more like his personal kingdom. He was the kind of man who measured grass with a ruler, who issued fines for leaving trash cans out a few minutes too long, and who once berated a single mother for painting her shutters the wrong shade of blue. To him, the HOA wasn't about maintaining order, it was about control. He thrived on it, waking up each day with a mission to remind everyone else that he was in charge. He strutted through block parties like a general inspecting his troops, his clipboard never far from reach. People smiled at him, but only out of politeness, never out of warmth. Behind closed doors, neighbors rolled their eyes, calling him names like the tyrant of the cul-de-sac or Captain Clipboard. But no matter how much people disliked him, they rarely stood up to him. Why? Because he had a talent for intimidation. He knew how to make people feel small, powerless, and guilty, even when they had done nothing wrong. That was his weapon, and he wielded it well. But that Saturday, his obsession with control collided with something he never expected, a child who didn't fit into his narrow vision of the perfect neighborhood. The boy was only 12, full of energy and innocence. And on that bright afternoon he was doing what kids have done for generations, shooting hoops in his driveway. The sound of the basketball echoed down the street, a steady rhythm of dribbles and thuds against the pavement, followed by the soft swish of the ball gliding through the net. To most people, it was the harmless sound of childhood, but to the HOA president, it was an offense. From across the street, his eyes narrowed. He watched the boy, his jaw tightening with every bounce of the ball. It wasn't against the rules, not technically, but that didn't matter. To him, the sight of a black child laughing and playing freely in his neighborhood felt like chaos invading his order. It didn't align with his picture of control, his carefully curated world, where everyone obeyed and fell in line. And so, with his chest puffed out and his voice ready to bark, he stormed across the street, determined to put an end to what he considered a disturbance. The boy froze when the shadow of the man loomed over him. At first he thought maybe it was just a grumpy neighbor telling him to keep it down. But the HOA president's tone was sharper, heavier, laced with something far more sinister. "You need to stop this right now," he snapped. "This kind of noise isn't welcome here." The boy's hands trembled around the basketball. He glanced toward his house, unsure if he should run inside or stand his ground. The president's finger jabbed through the air, nearly touching his face. "I've warned kids like you before," he hissed. "You don't belong here." The words stung deeper than the boy could show. He had lived in this neighborhood for almost a year now, but every time someone gave him that look like he was an outsider, chipped away at his sense of belonging. Still, he was only 12, and in that moment, fear outweighed everything. Else's lips parted as if to defend himself, but no words came out. The basketball rolled slowly away, stopping near the gutter. The street, once filled with the simple joy of play, now felt hostile and cold. Behind the curtains, neighbors watched. Some whispered, some frowned, but no one stepped outside. They had seen this routine before: the HOA president picking his target and unleashing his authority until the other person broke. But this time, something was different. This wasn't a grown adult who could push back. This was a child. And even the most indifferent neighbors felt a knot in their stomach watching the scene unfold. Still, no one opened their door. Fear of the man's wrath kept them frozen. The HOA president had built his empire on silence, and once again, silence was exactly what he received. But silence doesn't last forever, because inside that house, just a few steps away, the boy's father had heard everything. He had heard the shouting, the accusations, the belittling tone directed at his son. And though he had given this HOA president the benefit of the doubt before, that moment changed everything. With measured footsteps, the father reached for the doorknob. Calm but unshakable, he pushed it open and stepped out into the sunlight. The crowd watching from their windows had no idea what was about to happen. The HOA president had no idea what storm he had just unleashed. For the boy, seeing his father emerge was like breathing again after being held underwater. His fear melted into relief, but the HOA president's arrogance remained. He didn't step back, didn't apologize. Instead, he straightened his spine, ready to justify his actions to yet another parent who didn't understand the rules. What he didn't realize, what no one in that neighborhood yet understood, was that this man wasn't just a father. He was something much more, the kind of man who didn't just live under the rules of others. He wrote them. And the truth of who he was would change the entire neighborhood forever. On the corner lot, A 12-year-old boy was simply playing basketball in his driveway. It was one of those golden afternoons, the kind of day where summer felt endless and the world seemed wide open. He wasn't loud. He wasn't causing trouble, just dribbling, shooting hoops, and laughing at himself every time he missed a shot. The ball bounced rhythmically against the concrete, echoing softly down the street. For him, it was freedom. For the neighborhood, it was just another harmless sound of childhood. But to the HOA president, that bouncing ball was disruptive. The man had been watching from his porch, his eyes narrowing with every dribble. He was the kind of person who believed rules weren't just guidelines, they were weapons. His life revolved around enforcing them, no matter how small or insignificant they seemed. A trash can left out too long. Fine. A car parked too close to the curb. Warning letter. A kid playing basketball in his own driveway. To him, that was chaos, a violation of his precious order. And so, without hesitation, he stormed across the street, his heavy footsteps pounding against the pavement as though he were marching into battle. The boy looked up mid-shot, startled as the HOA president's voice cut through the air like a blade. Stop that, right now. The shout was so sharp it made the boy's hands tremble, the ball slipping through his fingers and rolling to the edge of the driveway. His smile vanished, replaced by confusion and fear. He couldn't understand what he had done wrong. It was his home, his driveway, his basketball. He wasn't hurting anyone, but the HOA president's face was twisted with irritation, his eyes filled with something darker than simple annoyance. You don't belong here, the man sneered, each word dripping with venom. It wasn't just about the noise, not really. His tone carried years of prejudice, of bitterness, of the belief that power meant putting others in their place. And in that moment, the target of his authority was a 12-year-old boy. The child's throat went dry. He took a small step back, clutching the ball to his chest like a shield. His heartbeat raced, thudding harder than the basketball ever had against the pavement. He wanted to run inside, but his feet wouldn't move. Fear froze him in place. The HOA president leaned closer, towering over him, jabbing a finger in his face. The man's breath was hot and heavy, his words cutting deeper with each second. Kids like you always cause problems. This is a respectable neighborhood, and you don't get to disrupt it with your nonsense. Behind the curtains of nearby houses, neighbors watched. One woman clutched her coffee mug tightly, her knuckles white as she whispered, "Not again." Another man shook his head but stayed rooted in his chair. They had all seen the HOA president pick fights before, but never like this. This was different. This wasn't a late trash pickup or an overgrown lawn. This was a child scared, vulnerable, and singled out for no reason other than existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Still, the blinds stayed shut. The doors stayed locked. Fear of retaliation kept them silent. Their hearts heavy with guilt, but their mouths closed. The boy's eyes darted toward his front door, silently pleading for someone to come out, someone to end this. His chest rose and fell quickly, his breaths shallow. The HOA president smirked, satisfied at the fear he had planted. To him, this wasn't just about enforcing some imaginary rule. This was about control, about intimidation, about making sure the boy knew his place. The man relished that power. He had used it against adults many times before, but now he was wielding it against a child and he felt untouchable. What he didn't realize, however, was that the boy was not as alone as he appeared. Just a few feet away, inside that quiet house, his father had been listening. At first he thought maybe it was just another neighborhood squabble, something that would blow over quickly. But as the words grew sharper, as the insults became more personal, he heard the tremor in his son's voice, the silence of fear. And that was when something inside him shifted. He set down the papers he had been reading, stood from his chair, and walked to the front door. His steps were measured, but there was a storm building in his chest. He had dealt with men like this before, men who thought fear was power, who believed they could control others through intimidation. But this was different. This was his child, his family, his responsibility to protect, and if the HOA president thought he could bully his son without consequences, he was about to discover just how wrong he was. The boy's small frame seemed to shrink under the weight of the man towering over him, but then, the sound of the door creaked open. The father stepped outside, his presence immediately shifting the energy on the street. He didn't rush, didn't shout. He simply stood tall, his gaze steady, his voice calm, yet commanding as he spoke. "Is there a reason," he said slowly, "that you're threatening my son?" The HOA president's bravado faltered for a split second, but he quickly tried to recover, straightening his back as though he were the one in control. "Your boy is disturbing the peace," he snapped. "Basketballs, noise, this kind of behavior, not welcome here. This neighborhood has rules." The father's eyes never wavered. His lips pressed into a thin line, his silence heavier than any shout. Then, with a deliberate motion, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a badge. The metal glinted under the sunlight, unmistakable and terrifying in its authority. The letters engraved on its EIA spoke louder than any words could dot. In that instant, the neighborhood shifted. The blinds that had been half closed opened wider. The silence that had hung heavy in the air broke into murmurs, and the HOA president, his face drained of color, His hands, once jabbing and forceful, now hung uselessly at his sides. He had thought he was the predator, but in that moment, everyone saw him for what he truly was. A small man who had just picked the worst possible family to mess with. Just as the HOA president's voice grew louder, the boy's father stepped out of the house. The sound of the door creaking open cut through the shouting, making the boy's heart leap with relief. He didn't yell. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his hand. He simply walked forward with calm, deliberate steps toward the confrontation. The kind of steps that carried weight long before he said a word. He was dressed sharply, even though it was only a Saturday afternoon. Crisp white shirt, sleeves perfectly pressed, polished shoes that clicked softly against the concrete. Presence alone shifted the air. Neighbors who had been hiding behind curtains now leaned closer, sensing that something was about to happen. This wasn't just another parent stepping in to scold the HOA president. There was something different about this man. Something about the way his shoulders were squared, the way his gaze never faltered. Respect didn't have to be demanded. It radiated from him. The HOA president turned to face him, puffing out his chest like a cornered animal. He had been so used to bullying others, so used to his voice being the loudest, that he assumed this confrontation would play out the same way. He drew in a breath, ready to bark at the father just as he had barked at the boy, but before a single word could leave his mouth, the father's voice cut through the air like steel. .com/even, but impossibly sharp. Is there a reason you're threatening my son? The sentence wasn't shouted. It wasn't dressed in anger. It was steady, clear, deliberate, and somehow, it carried more force than the HOA president's entire tirade. The boy felt a rush of safety, like a shield had materialized in front of him. The neighbors watching from their windows held their breath. For the first time, the HOA president faltered. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. At first, the arrogance that had fueled his rant just moments ago seemed to evaporate in the face of a man who did not flinch. When he finally found his words, they stumbled out clumsily. Your kid was disturbing the peace, he stammered. Basketball. Noise? This kind of thing isn't allowed here. I was just enforcing the rules. His voice cracked slightly at the end, his confidence already showing cracks. The father didn't blink. He didn't break his stare. His eyes were steady, his posture unshaken. He let the man's excuses dangle in the air, unsupported and flimsy. Then, in a voice so calm, it sent chills through the gathering crowd, he said, "You don't raise your voice at my son, ever." The words dropped like stone into a pond, the ripples spreading instantly. Some neighbors who had been peeking out of blinds stepped onto their porches, curiosity pulling them closer. Others exchanged glances, whispering about the way the father carried himself, about how unusual it was for the HOA president, the man who prided himself on never backing down, to be stammering. Like a child caught red-handed, the HOA president tried again to recover his swagger. He forced a smirk, though his lips trembled. "Look, I don't care who you are. I'm the HOA president. I make the rules around here. If your son doesn't follow them, there will be consequences." The father tilted his head slightly, almost as if studying the man in front of him. Then, with deliberate calmness, he reached into his jacket pocket. The movement was slow, precise, designed not to alarm, but to demand attention. The neighborhood grew utterly silent. Even the boy held his breath. And then, with a flick of his hand, the father pulled out an identification badge. It glinted under the afternoon sun, bold, unmistakable, and carrying 3 powerful letters, CIA. Gasps rippled through the small crowd now gathering at the edge of their lawns. A woman across the street pressed her hand to her mouth. A teenager whispered, "No way." The HOA president's smug grin vanished instantly. His face drained of color, his bravado melting away as the reality of what he was facing settled in. This wasn't just a father defending his son. This was a man who carried authority that stretched beyond their neatly trimmed neighborhood. A man whose very badge symbolized power, intelligence, and the ability to dismantle entire operations with a single order. The father didn't wave the badge around or shout about who he was. He simply held it up for a moment, just long enough for the HOA president to see, and then lowered it again. His message was clear. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to threaten. His presence and what he represented was enough. The HOA president's lips parted, but no words came out. For once, the man who thrived on intimidation stood frozen, stripped of his power. His eyes darted to the badge, then back to the father's unwavering stare. The silence pressed down on him like a weight. He opened his mouth again, trying desperately to salvage the situation. I didn't mean maybe I overreacted. Just trying to keep order, you know?" His voice was barely above a whisper now. The father stepped closer, closing the distance until only a few feet separated them. He didn't raise his voice, but each word he spoke was clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Order is not built on fear. Authority is not built on intimidation. You came after a child today. My child, don't ever make that mistake again." The HOA president swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. For the first time in years, he had no comeback, no fine to issue, no speech about rules. Just silence. The neighbors who had once feared his wrath now looked at him With something closer to disgust or perhaps pity, the father placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder, guiding him back toward the house. The boy looked up at him with wide eyes, the fear melting into awe. The crowd slowly began to disperse, whispers filling the air about what they had just witnessed. The HOA president remained rooted in place, his clipboard hanging limply at his side, his power shattered. He had built his authority on fear and intimidation, but in a single moment, it had all been stripped away by a man who didn't need to raise his voice to command respect. The neighborhood would remember that day for a long time. They would remember how quickly arrogance can crumble, how easily fear can be dismantled when faced with true authority. And the HOA president, he would never forget the moment his smug grin evaporated in the shadow of 3 simple letters: CIA. The neighborhood was silent, the kind of silence that makes even the birds pause, where every sound seems to hold its breath, waiting for what comes next. Every eye was fixed on the badge in the father's hand. It wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a symbol of power, of reach, of authority that extended far beyond the borders of this neatly manicured neighborhood. The letters gleamed in the afternoon light, bold and unmistakable. CIA. The father's expression never wavered, calm, controlled, deliberate. His voice came out low and steady, cutting through the silence like a razor. I don't think you realize who you're talking to, or what lines you've crossed. He didn't raise his tone, he didn't need to. The authority behind his words carried more weight than any shout ever could. The HOA president's lips curled into what was meant to be a laugh, but it came out fractured, trembling. He shifted uncomfortably, forcing his usual bravado into a mask that was now slipping badly. Come on, now, he muttered weakly. I was just enforcing the rules. Doing my job, no harm meant. You know how it is. But his voice cracked on the last syllable, betraying the fear he was desperately trying to hide. The father leaned in, just enough, not aggressive, not confrontational, but close enough that his words carried a sting that no one in that would ever forget. You targeted a child, my child, and you tried to intimidate him because of who he is. That's not just poor judgment. That's not just bad leadership. That's abuse of power. The words echoed through the neighborhood, bouncing off every window and front porch. The crowd that had been quietly forming at the edges of driveways shifted uncomfortably. Murmurs rippled across the group like a current. A woman near the corner folded her arms, her eyes narrowing at the HOA president. Another neighbor shook his head in quiet disgust. Some nodded in agreement, their faces finally reflecting what they had felt all along but never dared to say. Others, ashamed of their own silence, looked away, unable to meet the gaze of the father who stood so calmly defending his son. The father didn't pace, didn't wag his finger, didn't unleash a fiery speech. He didn't have to. His silence between sentences carried more power than the HOA president's shouting ever had. His badge spoke for him, the weight of it heavy in the air, and everyone knew the truth. The CIA wasn't an agency you wanted, knocking on your door, asking questions. It wasn't a group you wanted to provoke, not in your wildest dreams. The realization sank into the crowd like a stone sinking in water, slow at first. Then, undeniable, the HOA president's posture shifted. Just minutes earlier, he had stood, tall, puffed up with false authority, barking orders like a self-proclaimed king of the block. Now, he seemed to shrink before their eyes, his shoulders slumping under the invisible weight of his arrogance being dismantled. His face flushed red, then pale, the smirk he so often wore wiped clean. The same neighbors he had lorded over for years now saw him exposed not as a leader, but as a coward who had picked on a child to make himself feel powerful. For years, people had feared his clipboard, his fines, his constant threats of violations. But as the father's quiet authority filled the air, those fines suddenly seemed meaningless. Those threats now sounded hollow. The balance of power had shifted, and the neighbors felt it. The boy, standing a few steps behind his father, watched with wide eyes. The fear that had gripped him only minutes ago was melting away, replaced by something else. Pride. For the first time since the confrontation began, he straightened his back. His father's calm strength had created a shield around him, one stronger than anything the HOA president could ever break. The HOA president opened his mouth again, desperate to salvage his crumbling reputation. This is all a misunderstanding, he stammered, his voice uneven. The rules, the guidelines there for everyone's good? I wasn't singling anyone out. But the crowd wasn't buying it. His words landed flat, powerless, like a dull hammer striking air. The father didn't even bother responding right away. He let the silence do its work. He let the neighbors absorb the truth of what had just unfolded. Then, finally, he spoke, each word landing with the weight of a verdict. You've hidden behind rules to disguise prejudice. You've used your position to intimidate instead of protect. That ends now. The HOA president flinched, as if the words themselves were blows. Around them, the neighbors exchanged looks, some nodding in quiet agreement. A man who had lived there for years whispered, about time someone stood up to him. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The self-proclaimed ruler of the neighborhood now stood cornered, outmatched not by yelling or threats, but by calm, unwavering authority, backed by something far greater than a clipboard of citations. The father lowered his badge, slipping it back into his jacket with deliberate calm. He didn't need to wave it around anymore. Its presence had already done its work. He placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder, grounding him, reassuring him. Then he turned his back on the HOA president, not dismissing him with words, but with something far more cutting, indifference. And that, perhaps, was the final blow. Because in that moment, the once feared HOA president was no longer the center of attention. He was no longer in control. He was just a man standing in the middle of the street, exposed for what he really was: small, petty, and powerless in the face of true authority. The neighborhood would not forget this day. They would not forget the silence, the badge, the calm voice that stripped arrogance down to nothing. They would not forget how quickly a man who thrived on fear had been reduced to silence himself. And most of all, they would not forget the image of a father standing tall, protecting his son not with fists, not with shouts, but with presence, with truth, and with power that reached far beyond their quiet suburban street. The HOA president, once so loud and domineering, now stood as a husk of that image, shrinking under the weight of his own arrogance. The balance of power in the neighborhood had shifted forever, and everyone knew it. Word spread fast. By the next HOA meeting, the president was no longer boasting about his authority. Instead, he sat in silence while neighbors demanded answers. Some even called for his removal, disgusted by his treatment of a child. The boy, meanwhile, went back to playing basketball in his driveway, this time with neighbors cheering him on. The father didn't press charges, didn't seek revenge. He didn't need to. The message had been delivered loud and clear. Power isn't about intimidation. True authority is calm, steady, and protects the vulnerable. The HOA president learned the hard way that abusing power against the wrong family can end careers, reputations, and pride in a single moment. And the neighborhood, they would never forget the day a father quietly revealed he was more than just a homeowner. He was a protector and the head of one of the most powerful agencies in the world.